So many people.
I know. Did you all enjoy the film? That's so great.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks for sticking around and coming. You could be doing anything tonight, but you're here with me, and I appreciate that. It's
That's like
Jay-Z.
from a song.
Yeah.
Oh. Sorry. I promise I'm cool. But I'll just get started with the discussion on the movie. So I'm just going to jump right in. And this is probably a question that people have asked several times, but I'm just going to ask it again anyway. What inspired you to make the film? But as you talk about that, could you talk about your decision to move to Alabama and kind of weave that into, well, if it's supposed to be woven in, could you weave that into it?
I can weave it in. I'll start with the moving first because that happened before I was inspired to make the film. I moved to Alabama in 2009 just to work in a community organization that was helping youth age 16 to 24 kind of get back into school and get their GED and get some workforce development training. And it was just a profound experience. I kind of spontaneously moved. I didn't sort of intend to, really get deeply involved in like my artistic practice and do sort of what it seems like I intended to do, which I did in the process of making it, but not sort of beforehand. And knowing two guys that I became really close with for, I think I knew them about 3 years before we started shooting, and like coaching basketball and just meeting people and seeing the landscape and watching television and watching movies and being interested and like taking photos. There's just this huge gap, an absence of their representation or the community's representation in cinema, in contemporary photography, not photojournalistic photography, but sort of more conceptual photography. And in art house films, there was just no sort of, obviously there's a couple, but there's like no historic contemporary South. And so I kind of took it on.
Oh, cool. So before I kind of dive directly or specifically into the film, as I was watching it, I kept waiting for something to guide me toward what I was supposed to take out of it, and I never got that. I felt like as a viewer, I was doing a lot of work to kind of navigate through the film. Was that intentional?
Ooh, I sure hope so. That'd be the worst. I was like, no, actually, it was.
I guess the larger question is what inspired you to do it that way instead of kind of forcing us to see a message?
Yeah. No, I appreciate that specific question because, I started making this film and, it was a 5-year shooting process. 5 months into it, I made a cut that was really traditional. It was more sort of a voiceover documentary with Daniel doing something and Quincy doing something. And it had emotion and it had some of those things that docs are really well at doing. And I couldn't imagine someone coming to sort of new conclusions about what it's like for them to be there or for me to be there. And so I sort of started breaking up the scenes and the narrative and just kind of focusing on moments that were, I thought, to be beautiful and symbolic and metaphoric. And I found that it allows myself, to like enter into that, those semiotics, and allows me to enter into that world and complete the film and complete the moment and kind of participate in whatever sense in the film, way more than sort of being guided along through a process. And then that became the goal of the film, was to create this sort of, however long the film is, piece that can only be completed by a person, and it can't be completed the same way by different people because it takes their extreme individuality to come up with meaning. And then I figured you could also sort of use that method as it relates to Black imagery to use the film as a Rorschach test for your relationship to the Black community and to Blackness, which I thought is something that's needed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess I'm going to skip around now. Did you, as you were thinking about how you conveyed Blackness in this film, did you have a particular audience in mind, or was everyone kind of expected to see this and take what they will from it? And did you have any hesitation about kind of playing on things that are typically seen as Black stereotypes, but just putting those in the film and how they might be received by non-rural or non-Black audiences?
Yeah. So the film, it's weird. Like, I tried to make the film not about Blackness, and then you make it about Blackness.
Right.
Because blackness is a contradiction. It's fact and fiction simultaneously. And so, I knew that there was, to me, there seemed to be a lack of, at least in commercial media, a lack of the banal and the mundanity of what it is to be Black. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to concentrate on moments that sort of didn't have that sort of traditional narrative drive, that were just more slow, but then also had a sort of epic moment to them, which would kind of provide the attention that can get someone through a couple of different moments. I knew that it would register different in each community, and it was kind of proven true in that most Black folks that watch the film appreciate that the film shows the way in which they look at their children, or the way in which we look at our children, as opposed to a lot of white audiences are like, oh, look at the intimacy, or look at the access, or look at I haven't seen these moments before. But Black folks are like, yes, I know that moment, and this is sort of the life that I've always lived, but it doesn't have sort of utility in main film in traditional films, because it's difficult to sell nothing, or the banal. The banal doesn't have commercial value in some sense.
So do you think it'll ever show up in films?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
aside from yours.
Well, I think it's about learning. I mean, there's literally an infinite amount of ways to structure a film, to make a film, to visualize a community, to visualize a person, and it's about just exploring new ones. And industry specifically guides you towards a specific method of doing something, right. And so you tend, when Black folks, the Black middle class is always been around, but burgeoning now. There's more people that have access to cameras. Cameras are more accessible. Now, once we're getting into the larger industry, we tend to move towards modes of making that provide income, because we need to survive as well, But obviously, there's tons of artists who are doing amazing things, and people who are kind of subverting things within even traditional narrative structures. But I think it's just about acknowledging that there's a million ways to do something, and finding a team around you that believes that you can do it in a way that doesn't necessarily fit the mold of something before. And there's so many people doing it now.
Yeah. As you followed Quincy and Daniel around, I know you weren't trying to make any overt points, but did you find them at all trying to kind of create a story around themselves, or create a narrative as you were following them around?
That's one of the best questions someone's asked me.
Oh, well, thank you.
Because, yes, and it's really interesting to see what cinema and photography has done to a person's performance in front of the camera. Once a person saw themselves in a photo the first time, now they know what it means to be photographic, So now they can carry on their life, or they can perform in a picture in a way in which they would hope to be seen, which then just has this sort of ricochet effect for forever. So obviously now it's really difficult for people to even walk down the street without thinking about what they look like in a camera or in whatever. So those guys definitely tried to, in some points, mold their story, or say things, or act a certain way, knowing that it would be hopefully that would be seen. But I think that's inevitable for everyone, and I don't think the degrees to which they did it were corrosive to the film. I think the amount of time that I spent with them, the amount of time that I do spend with them, lends towards a process of almost dissolution of performativity, because it's time-based and you can only perform so much, and the way in which I was filming and the way in which I participated in their lives was way more participatory and less voyeuristic, and which means that in the same way that you fundamentally perform with your friends at all times, that's kind of what it was, in which we're like family and friends, and you're performing, but not necessarily more, but maybe more at times, and it's just about sort of, finding the balance for the audience or for the film, I guess.
Okay. And this is my last question.
But also, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead. No, this is your film.
I can ramble unendingly on a question just for fear of being inadequately responding. So sometimes you can just be like,
I'm not going to do that.
And I'm like, okay. Because that last one was like, I could have finished in 3 sentences, but I was like, it's silent.
Do you want to add anything else?
It's quiet. No. Just like, I'm just going to keep talking until your eyes glaze over. But they didn't. Thank you for not glazing.
I find this interesting, so they won't glaze over. Okay, so, but this is my last question, kind of in this vein. Okay, so you didn't specifically guide us toward anything, but you did have these questions that popped up on the screen, and you also made decisions about what footage would actually make it into the film. So could you talk a little bit about why you even used the questions and why you used the questions that you did, but also, what you kept in the film, what you chose to, what does it, leave on the cutting room floor?
Yeah.
Is that what it is? Okay. And just how you chose what people ultimately saw today.
Yeah, so I kind of forgot the first half of the question while thinking about the second.
The questions.
Oh, the questions,
Yeah.
yeah. The language in the film. So the idea of the film was to be sort of fundamentally like visual, right? Like all visual, to be the Rorschach test, to exalt Daniel and Quincy's lives and the community, to sort of participate. And so it got to a point that when we were watching, I had an edit team, so I edited the film, but I had like some really savvy folks working with me. This guy RaMell Ross and producer Jocelyn Barnes and this woman Maya Krinsky. And so we're watching the film and we're talking about what potentially these things are doing, and we kind of found that because some of the images were relatively unique. There's a sort of delay that happens in which you sort of like you're thinking about what just happened and you're missing what's happening, and so that's a big problem because the film is very intentionally cumulative and it's very intentionally using images to build and then to like drop and then to build and then it's about momentum. I mean, all films are in some sense, and so we decided, because I write a lot anyway, we decided that we just needed, the audience needed breaks, and so instead of just using black screens, like how could we, one, offer the imagery more of the perspective that I was intending, but simultaneously give the person a break, and we decided to use like just poetry. So I just wrote a whole bunch of stuff and we negotiated and talked about it. There's a co-writer on the film, Maya Krinsky, who was, it's weird because co-writing is like a weird thing for documentaries. It's like kind of is almost oxymoronic. It's like, wait, you're telling me this is written. But her role was like really helping me shape sort of the understanding of the images and some of the language. Anyway, I'm doing the rambling thing, but yeah. It's also really interesting that in the same way that the imagery is cumulative, so is the language. There's a sort of relationship between the almost fantastical value of what's being mentioned and the amount of the relationship between my relationship to the community and the length of time being there and the sort of understanding that one comes through after knowing something for a really long time. You're in a relationship and everything's idealistic and everything's wonderful. You're projecting, and then 4 years later, you're like, whoa, it's this person, who I love, and everything's the same, but it's slightly different. So the language kind of has that thing, but about the moments. So what to me was most interesting is what can't be predicted. That's kind of that's the most fundamental thing, I think. One of the most universal things. There's a couple things that are universal. One is, someone being able to walk around a corner and legitimately not knowing what's there. So I wanted to participate in Daniel Quincy's lives to be able to capture those moments, because those are the ones that are outside of the industrial model of filmmaking because they take too much time to get and people have budgets. And it's also a kind of a political statement because, given the relationship between racism, photography, cinema, dissemination of stereotypes and narrativizing and struggle narratives, no one wants to look at the Black community long enough for these moments to be captured. It's kind of fundamentally counter our relationship between media, and so it offers one. It sort of highlights the truth that media, photography, and cinema are fundamentally things that replace experience, and it's been a problematic replacement of experience with the Black community. Most people don't have intimate relationships with the nuclear Black family. It just doesn't exist. So like this sort of, to me, provides that experience of an experience that you actually just don't have, and therefore like shows the problem of the past use of the mediums.
I'm just going to ask two more questions so that the audience can ask a few questions. But I know we've had a lot of this conversation focused on Quincy and Daniel, but I also wanted to ask about the women in the film. Were they there to provide context to Quincy and Daniel, or were we supposed to take any of their individual stories out of it? And I was specifically thinking about Boosie, and she didn't say much in the film at all, but I felt like so much happened to her. Like she lost a child, and granted Quincy lost a child as well, but I just felt like I saw so much with her, even though she didn't say much during the film. And then Mary was a lot more talkative, but I just found her relationship with her son very interesting, whereas she didn't have him around until he was 11 or living with her, and then was telling him at, I guess, what is he, like 18 or 19, that he's like home too much and needs to kind of be out on his own. So if you could just kind of elaborate on the women in the film and how they add to the story.
Yeah, like it's really interesting because my entrance into both of their families is through Daniel and Quincy, you know? And so I'm only there when they're there mainly. And I'm sort of shooting, you know, fundamentally close to their perspective, just because I knew them for so long. Boosie is really fascinating because, you know, she met Quincy when she was really young, and she had, you know, these children really young. And she's not quite, you know, she wasn't as, like, it was really like kind of like Quincy's film, you know, and she was she was really into the idea, you know, this is fascinating. It's difficult to talk about because, you know, I'm still sort of unsure as to even the language too. I think this kind of speaks to Boosie's relationship to the film, in that she like asked me to film all the births. I missed the first one because I was out of town, which was really devastating. The second time I was there, I got it. I shot. They had another child a year and a half ago named King. I also filmed that birth, and it was quite poetic, and devastatingly poetic in that one of the children passed away, and then we had the footage so that she can see her child, and because they weren't recording anything otherwise, so they don't really have any photos aside from the one or twos that are on the phone. And so her relationship to me being there, I think, was even more than Quincy, because he was a musician and was used to the camera. The way in which I was there, I think for her was like to literally archive her life, you know, to like be that memory, or be that sort of, because they don't even have many photos of them when they were children. Just to sort of almost like the silent guy for hire or something strange. Mary's relationship to the film and me, I think is quite beautiful, because I see her as like the strongest person in the entire film. She literally worked at the catfish plant for 20 years. Like she, you know, was taking care of Daniel from a distance when Daniel was a child. It was hard to figure out the register to put both of them in the film, because I didn't want the film to be about really anyone aside from the visualization of them, because I wanted people to imagine what their lives are like and think about the range of representations they have of these folks, and then therefore see that there's a huge lack of representation of these folks. But yeah, I guess that's kind of it.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to ask my last question so that the audience can have enough time to ask their questions. Unless people don't have questions, then I'll ask it. But the ushers have microphones, so if you have a question, you can just raise your hand and they will bring one to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I enjoyed that. And I wonder if you saw an Italian film a couple of years ago called Fuoco al Mare, which is Fire at Sea.
Oh, yeah, I did.
I loved that movie, and I think of it as one of the best films ever made, and so take it as a great compliment that I feel like the style of your film is very resonant to that style. And so in the vein of the slow, careful documentation, I'm curious to know what drove your choices to extend the length of any one segment. So for instance, the little girl holding the dog, you almost shot that like a photograph, and it stays there for a long, long time. And there's footage of the child, running back and forth that goes on forever. And then there are segments that are just really short and fleeting and more fugitive. So I'm curious to know whether you made those choices because those captivated you, or you really felt like that was necessary for the narrative or for the audience's captivation.
Yeah, I liked Fire at Sea. I think I'm like I'm trying to describe my my super romantic relationship to everything, but also extremely cynical. It's like what is it? I don't know. I'm not even gonna attempt to. I'm like tongue-tied. But so for me, like the moments in here that were moving when I was capturing them. I'm kind of like, okay, it's difficult to. I can weep over a like tree branch like bending slowly in the wind, but then also like scoff at contemporary dance. Or just like ugh. But then also love contemporary dance. It's like. So I figure that if it could like move me in with this like overly romantic and overly cynical thing, then it would move someone else because of what I just mentioned. And so to me, what's one of the biggest problems with the African American experience is that people think they know it. They think they understand. We think we understand. There's this relationship between consumerism and industry that's pretty devastating. And so I wanted people to participate in the visualization and go through a range of thoughts, not just get these not get something that's like easily consumed, To me, there's like nothing more damaging, arguably, and this is just taking a cynical view of photography, though I love photography and I will stand behind it forever, than like a portrait photograph in which a person's like, oh, okay, done, and they leave, Or they look at it and they're like, oh, look at the wrinkles on the eyes, and oh, what a person, You're like that photograph is just put into an archive of easy reading, Like I want to bring complexity, I want to bring ambiguity to blackness in order to open up its meaning. And this is an opportunity, like with the Kyrie scene running, for you, the viewer, to go through a full range of thoughts, from, oh, how cute, to like, oh, God, is something wrong with this kid? Oh, God, is something wrong with me for thinking there's something wrong with this kid? Why is he so adorable? Is he adorable? Was that a gun? Is he running? How's he still running? Man, that's weird. Am I weird? And that happens with like the long shots. You almost drift and then come back, and you're forced to think. A lot of imagery and a lot of films they allow you to consume, and I wanted to do a little bit more, which is why some are long. I also think it's more interesting. Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, sure.
My question is about the sound design and the music, and I'm wondering, in terms of, leaving it ambiguous enough for any audience member to get what they want, how did you approach the sound design and the music? I think that is my question.
So I'm such a big fan. I don't think anyone here has probably seen my photography, but my photography, I like in the historic South, it's ambiguous, but it's like I'm a fan of strategic ambiguity, not just like, it's whatever you want it to be. Like let's be a little bit more controlled or concise. Not that the other one's not bad, but in terms of my process, the sound design, I think starts with one of the fundamental ideas of the film, which is to How do you use imagery like music? You know, how do you create a space that doesn't have the same sort of logic that we learned in when we were in elementary school? You know, the same logic of society. How do you create something that is way more, you know, visceral, participatory, ineffable, and something you want to return to because you love the atmosphere of it. And then when you're out of it, you're out of it, and you kind of look back, you know? So the film, in order to sort of do that, you know, kind of scrapped narrative a little bit, and the 3-act structure or whatever, and scrapped the traditional, like, traditional structure, and approached and had 5 visual movements in the film. So I think one of the composers is here right now, Alex Summers. Where's Alex? Oh, there he is. Yeah, this guy's a mad genius. Hey, Alex. So it's 5 visual movements, and each one, the middle one is after Burt Williams comes up, and you know what happens when all the cotton's picked, and the 4th one is the Whose Child Is It sequence. So that's the first thing about the music. The second thing, the sound design is literally taken all inspiration, because this is my first film, and so I hadn't really worked with big equipment and, you know, trying to fill up this sort of space. Was taken from Lucretia Martel's La Ciénaga. It's an amazing piece that's just deceptively complex in its simplicity, but what I noticed the first time I watched it, my producer introduced me to the film, was that you're watching the film and you go through it, and then like when you're thinking about it, when I thought about it the next day, I remembered things that didn't happen, because there's like so many conversations and sounds happening off the screen that it just like it gets you really lose the theater experience and have the experience of the film that she wants. And so we tried to bring that sort of sonic complexity to it, while also staying true to the way in which the film was recorded, which it was just a Mark III with an on-camera mic. So you know, it's perspectival. So like if you walk away, the voice sort of also goes. And then once we filled it out in the way in which we wanted, then we started to play with the idea of the film's sound having its own memory, like the film having its own memory, right? So you have the flutist that constantly returns and plays in the background, so you're thinking about when you heard it before. You have the cheerleaders who then return again, and it sort of it makes its own meaning, kind of. Those are some of the general principles. A lot of it's just play as well. You know.
Hi. Thank you for the film. Okay, first I want to comment on what you said about the banality of Black life not showing up in media and film really quickly, and then I wanted to comment on 2 scenes. So as far as the banality not showing up, I think it's because what that does, and it is a media tool and it's very political, is it allows, well, to be honest, white people to dehumanize Black people by not seeing these everyday scenes because they know they have those scenes and that in their own personal lives. And so that they won't have to bridge that gap. Not everyone across the board, but those who don't want to, don't have to, because they can only see the tragedies, the big themes, and not just the everyday. So I think that that's a very conscious decision, and as you said, the media chooses what it wants to show. So, okay, as far as the 2 scenes I wanted to comment on, one was the one where the guy was talking about the fake comedy movie he was envisioning where there were no guns, and then he was talking about police would have to go back in the days and use spears. I was curious as to how you maybe, I don't want to say wanted that scene to play, but how you thought it might play, if people would feel some guilt about seeing the humor in it, because it was funny, but it's kind of very sad that that's really what it's come to, is that young Black men have to think about ways to like shut the cops down and make it a little harder for them to get shot in the back. So yeah, the fact that he has to envision it as like a pseudo-comic movie is very frightening in a way. So I'm glad you included it, because again, that would be, in my opinion, one of those moments that you like that make people say, what does that say about me? And as to how I react to it. Second one, I think is very important. Okay, the guy from New York, and he was talking about how do we define wealth? And he said that him not having rural experiences, but getting to pick nuts and do all of the rural things, take his shoes off in red clay, was very important to him, and he didn't want that devalued. I'm from New York too. I totally agree with that, and I have several relatives that grew up in similar circumstances to the people in this film. And so it's a very different experience, it's a different upbringing, and it produces a different kinds of person. But I think within the Black community, we forget that there's a trade-off for that, because these people are disenfranchised through education, through, as we said, 20 years in the catfish factory, and what does she really have to show for it? But like an aching back, working in industry. Those are most of the jobs that you're going to be privy to living in an environment like this, being disenfranchised from these channels that will take you towards actual wealth. And you can be disenfranchised anywhere, but I mean, again, so just if you could comment maybe on those two scenes, I think that they were very, very strong. And specifically on that last one, how do we bridge that gap between the urban and the rural Black community so we both understand we're both losing something, so don't fetishize one or the other. Like, find that we need to see that it's still all disenfranchisement, and how do we address that?
Yeah, good questions. I don't really have, I'm one person without answers. But I say stuff, but I don't really think it's necessarily repeatable or a solution. First, I'll say that I think the biggest problem, a bigger problem than white folks not wanting to see images of the banal in order to bridge that gap, is the pre-existing structure that we're in that doesn't allow for those images to be sent anywhere. Because if there are pockets, large portions, large cities in which people just don't see the images and they don't know any Black people. And so that's literally the recipe for racism. I don't think it's fundamentally people's faults. It's actually the way in which things are. And so people are sort of trapped in their own obliviousness. And it's quite devastating for that to be the case. Living in Alabama was that shocker in which you're like, oh, where you live and what you watch is the equation for racism. And if you're introduced to non-racist ideas, you can't really, you would hope that someone would have some fundamental critical thinking or some moral foundation that would change being introduced to stuff that's not racist. But if someone is introduced to Black people in really shitty, stereotypical movies in media outlets where they're always committing crimes, and they live beside an impoverished community in which, while people have the choices not to commit crimes, there's a sincere lack of choices. So choosing between three awful choices isn't really a choice. And that's the community you live beside. What the fuck are they supposed to think? It's not that they're going to be like, you know what? Everyone's equal. They're going to be like, this is what I'm fed, and I'm an eater. But with the Nate scene, I think the most interesting thing about that one was that he was like interested. The punchline to that one was like, the only way that you can die is if you get hit in the heart. And him desiring to be able to run from authority and just not die. And maybe that's really obvious for everyone, but I still think about that being like the main takeaway. Probably a little disappointing answer, huh?
We can do one more quick question.
I'll talk to you about it after that last one, because your questions are so big,
I couldn't help but notice that the Thai director of Pitchapong, Weerasethakul, was listed as, I think it was creative consultant on the film. So I was curious about what input he had towards what we saw on the screen tonight.
He made the film. Just kidding. That'd be pretty cool though. It'd probably be better. So my producer Jocelyn Barnes worked with him on Uncle Boon Me. And if anyone here, I think you guys are in the Hamburg Museum, so you probably heard of Apichatpong Weerasethakul, but he's a Thai director that is not really a Thai director and more of like a demigod that uses the film medium to speak his spiritual truth. You know, it's like this weird thing he does. But his work is incredibly idiosyncratic and wholly singular and challenging and beautiful and kind of everything I think each person as a maker in anything should really strive towards. But my producer worked with him and basically just thought that he would be interested in the film. And I was like, whatever, you know, I'm not gonna say no, but it's pretty unlikely. It's, you know, he's a demigod. Demigods they don't mentor, you know? Yeah, so he was really into it and agreed to just give us feedback on some cuts. So we would, you know, make an edit. This is like late in the game, last 3 or 4 months. Send it to him, and he would kind of just give us his flat feedback, and then we would come back and, you know, see if what he said was what we were interested in, one, and if what he said was what we were going towards, and we would continue our path. Send it to him again. So it was kind of that relationship. It was quite generative because in the same way that his films are like simple but profound, so is his feedback. It's just like a couple words and sentences, and they're just like, how did you just summarize the Big Bang in 2 words in an email? Something like that, I don't know.
Well, let's give RaMell one more round of applause.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's no problem.
And the hammer. Thank you, hammer.
Yeah.
Lipsticks.